What's been your experience of working business? Because a lot of people think that business is the problem rather than the solution. It's actually created the inequalities, created the poverty, it's created the generation of overconsumption. I mean, what's been your experience?
My experience has been that I've never met a business person that doesn't actually care about sustainable development in some way, care about an environmental issue, a social issue, an issue of economic injustice. In fact, every single business person I've worked with, which is thousands in the different companies I've worked with, has some issue they're particularly passionate about.
So let's look at the journey, because obviously, CSR as it started out is 10, 15 years old. That sort of moved into the more progressive companies into sort of embedded sustainability. But, from you watching that journey, where do you think business in general has got to, and where do you think it needs to go to from here?
I think we've made a good start to the journey. That's probably how I'd characterise it. I think some of the biggest companies in the world who use a lot of resources directly or in their value chains and meet lots of consumer needs have begun to not only understand how they need to change, how their value chains need to change, but they've also started to act on it in quite interesting, exciting ways. And we started to see results, although there is a lot more to come. The next big challenge is to take that to the next tier, to take that to the medium and small companies who are all over the world, where the majority of economic activity actually takes place, the majority of resource use really takes place, and to think about how they can also manage their impact, have a more positive impact. And that's a challenge. It requires big businesses like mine, SABMiller, to be working with our suppliers and working with the other people in our supply chain. It requires governments in some stages to get involved, although hopefully not too bureaucratically. It involves NGOs and others being prepared to actually work with businesses of different sizes and put effort in to help them to understand. And it involves consumers and citizens being active. And that's perhaps the most difficult piece.
One of the things you're talking about there is the importance of collaboration.
First of all, I think collaboration is one of the biggest victories, as it were, in this journey over the last 15 or 20 years. I think in the early 90s and late 80s, there was a lot of challenge of big business, rightly so, from a lot of different NGOs that had sprung up and become powerful, and business started to respond to that. And I think what's been most progressive over the last 10 or 15 years is the way that partnerships and different forms of collaborations have developed between businesses and those who were formerly criticising them or still sometimes criticising them.
What do you see as the future of collaboration? Are we going to see them grow and just multiply, or actually is there a risk it might go into reverse?
There is definitely a risk that we face in terms of the complexity of some of these issues, how they connect together, and the frustration that might lead to in some groups in society. There are a lot of big companies, I think, as we saw at Rio, that are very committed to working on environmental issues like water and climate change, social inclusion issues around economic development, from small farmers to distributors to the role of women in different levels of economic activity. But that's going to take a long time, and it will take a lot of partnerships that will need to be quite carefully crafted. And you can understand why some people who want to see change in the world now get very frustrated with that. I think there's a risk, though, which is that if we have too many of these groups who've been involved in the debates, some of the NGOs who choose to step out of those partnership processes and instead wave the flag and really start protesting again, we actually might lose some of the momentum and goodwill we've built up between business and NGOs and governments, and for me that would be a great shame.
Everyone's talking about the water, energy, food nexus, so saying you can't do one without the other. So firstly, for people listening, what is the food, energy, water nexus, and how do you start to manage that complexity where you cannot look anymore in terms of one issue in isolation?
Well, the water, food, energy nexus is a way of understanding the interconnections between those different resources. So agriculture uses 70% of the fresh water in the world, but actually energy production also uses a lot of water. In the US, something like 40–50% of fresh water is used to generate energy. At the same time, pumping and treating water actually also uses a lot of energy. So, I think 6% of the UK's greenhouse gas emissions comes actually from the water industry, from treating and cleaning and pumping water. And then actually, if you get agriculture, wrong, if agriculture is very polluting, then it can of course damage water supplies. So it's no good having an environment department in a government that sets a water strategy, an agriculture department in a government that sets an agriculture and farming strategy, and an energy department that sets its own energy strategy, and then probably, goodness knows, you might have an infrastructure department as well or something else, and then the finance ministry. All of those different parts of government setting different strategies with different goals without realising they're all impacting on each other all the time. So there's all sorts of opportunities when you start to look at these in an interconnected way. But it can also become complex and overwhelming. And that's why we need quite smart interaction between particularly the academics who've thought a lot of this through, the NGOs who have a lot of the kind of ecological expertise and experience and understand valuing nature and engaging communities around nature, and the businesses who are pretty good at figuring out the economic dimension of this, and start working on it together.
You're obviously very fortunate that you've worked with companies that have taken this issue very seriously. There are a lot of sustainability professionals like you who have got jobs in companies where they're still sort of trying to get their voice heard. They're still trying to help companies to that first stage of change, and often finding it very, very hard. What's your advice to people like that?
I think it's first about being very clear about what the issues are that will affect your business. Environmental issues, social issues, broader economic issues. It's about then being very brutal almost in your judgment of which of those are the most material to the business and which you might achieve a minimum standard on, an acceptable standard, but then not do any more. And it's showing the management of the business, of the main functions of the business, that you've taken those decisions. That you're not coming to them every day and asking them to do 8 different things on entirely different issues because a certain person expects them to do it. But actually you're thinking seriously about their business, the things that affect the business day to day, the operating environment they're in, whether they're in Europe or Latin America or Africa or the US, and understanding how, helping them understand which of these most material issues will affect them at what stage in the next 2 years, 5 years, 10 years, and then helping them develop an appropriate response. And if you do it that way, if you do it in a way that says, I recognise you're an extremely busy person, that you've got 800 things to do already today, and here's another 3. Actually being able to show how it helps achieve their business goals is always the first step.
What would happen to those companies that don't address these issues?
Ultimately, they'll be the companies that should be picked up through regulation, normally at the national level, to ensure that they're meeting an acceptable and progressing minimum standard. And I think one of the really interesting things about the discussions between business leaders and government leaders in the last few years has been the willingness of business to say, look, we don't want bureaucratic regulation, but there are these certain issues where government, we need you to help us sort this problem out. Water is chronically underpriced. Therefore, it's utterly wasted across agriculture. We need you to help price water properly, even though it will affect our value chains, even though it will mean we might have to pay a bit more for the things we buy, so that resource is there in the future.
But what do you think about those? I mean, there are companies that are actively lobbying to stop things happening.
Clearly there are companies that are still in those positions that you talk about. And I think one of the things that we will see more and more, and it's not an easy cultural thing for business to do, but is businesses calling each other out on it. And it very rarely, if you think about it, very rarely do you see a CEO anywhere call out another industry, call out another grouping of companies because they think they need to do something. If they wanted that, they'd have gone into politics, but they didn't. They went into business, right? But I think we will have to see in coming years groups of companies who understand the risks that they themselves face from climate change, from water scarcity, from biodiversity destruction, whatever else, calling out other groups, other sectors, saying, it's your sector that's causing a lot of the problem that's putting my business at risk. We haven't seen much of that yet. I think we'll begin to see more of it. And I think it's a difficult area. It's an area that probably happen more behind closed doors than it will publicly. But I think it will happen.
There's that huge debate about, every company wants to expand. So SAB you want to expand your business. But every company that wants to expand, even if you try and decouple that from resource use, you can only do a certain amount. And that actually, you can do all the things you want to do, all the things you're talking about, but actually in the scale of change, scale of expansion, we can't have this growth and still be sustainable. So how can a company like yours sort of continue to say, oh, well, we can grow and get better? Not everyone can do that, surely.
I'm a firm believer that we can have growth and it can be sustainable. But we need to start with the consumer. we have a middle class now of what, 2 billion people around the world. If you look at the OECD stats, by 2030 it'll be near 5 billion, a very dramatic change. And people on middle incomes who are getting their first access to transport, their first access to a coffee a few times a week, a beer at the end of the day, whatever it is. There is no way that any group, I don't think, in a developed country that's grown through the last couple of centuries of resource use in the world with colonialism and everything else, can say that we can't allow that growth to happen. So the question has to be, how do we enable that growth? How do we make sure that we can give people a better quality of life, but do it in a sustainable way, because it has to? And I think there are a number of things that will achieve that, and we've discussed it, but there are dramatic changes in resource efficiency that we will see. And I think in some ways a lot of the environmental movement has heard business talking about environmental efficiency for 5 years and thought, well, they haven't cracked it, they haven't delivered it, so it's a load of, it's not going to happen. Actually, it's taken that period to really understand it, quantify it, embed it in our strategies, set targets, start to make the investments. The change will be dramatic. I think there's a lot of change that we will see in terms of product innovation and dramatically different ways of doing things. We've done a whole lot of work on Brewery of the Future, which envisages what breweries will look like in 10 or 15 years and in dramatically different resource ways, working with the University of Nottingham on kind of extreme brewing in different environments. All sorts of industries are doing that. So I think there's a lot of innovation, resource efficiency, partnerships that together can help us achieve that goal of meeting consumer needs. And that means, of course, some companies will grow and some will not, because that's what competition's about. But ultimately, we need to meet those consumer needs, I think.
Great, thank you very much.